We heard of this for the first time the next morning, and Ellen Dulles called me over and said, "You'll have to make some provision for the families of those 4 flyers." Through brackets an ad hoc in brackets mechanism, we paid benefits to the family for a considerable length of time until we were able to turn it over to the Bureau of Employees Compensation. This was a very makeshift arrangement, and so based on that, I came to the conclusion that we needed a much more formal and flexible instrument, and so after long consideration within the agency, we acquired the first 2 insurance entities which had been in being before, and then we flushed them out a little bit. Footnote 17. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 17. Houston, January 1776, page 8. Assuming the reading. Thus, the formation of this entity represented the, quote, culmination of experience, end quote, in this support area. According to Houston, although the complex originally operated under the Domestic Operations Division, a special board of directors later assumed control of the proprietaries and their investments. In July 1973, control of the complex was transferred to the commercial and cover staff. The current status. All of the clients of the project are agency employees. Footnote 17a. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 17a. The complex itself is only for covert non-staff officers of the CIA. In essence, it only works for what would broadly be described as, quote, agents, end quote, those not entitled to participate in the CIA retirement plan or in the Civil Service retirement plan. They are primarily foreigners and usually work for DDO. In the case of most agents, the CIA contributes 7% and the agent contributes 7%, in keeping with CIA practice for regular employees. In cases where the agent is well along in years and contributions from the agency, and the agent would not provide enough funds to capitalize an annuity, the agency provides the initial capitalization. However, such an arrangement must be approved by the DDO. Resuming the reading. The complex was originally capitalized in 1962 with $4 million. Most of the assets are held outside the United States, and the companies do not write insurance in the United States. Each of the United States companies pays little tax and is audited by a proprietary firm. This method of self-insurance enables the agency to funnel money where needed in any of its project categories. Currently, 60% of the investments are in long-term interest-bearing securities, abroad 20% in offshore time deposits in the United States banks, and the balance is in common stocks, debentures, and commercial paper of various types. In the past 12 years, the sale of stocks has resulted in profits in excess of $500,000, accruing to the CIA. The combined total assets of the complex are in excess of $30 million, including its retained net earnings of approximately $9 million. In 1970, the Inspector General examined the insurance complex. His report raised questions about briefing, congressional oversight subcommittees, which indicate that Congress had never been informed of the existence or extent of the insurance complex, which had grown to an organization with assets of $30 million without oversight, knowledge, or approval. While annual audits of the complex were conducted, there was no annual allotment and no annual operational review within the CIA, because the insurance activity was no longer a true project after its removal from the Domestic Operations Division. End of page 218, beginning page 219. Houston indicated that the complex had been operating, quote, for some time, end quote, before we told our committees any detail. I think it was mentioned as a problem that we had to make arrangements to cope with insurance problems fairly on, but the fact that it was a business and a business of this substance was not done for some time. My recollection is that there was not deliberate avoidance. We just didn't get to it. Footnote 18. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 18. Houston, January 15, 76, page 81. Resuming the reading. With regard to buying and selling securities, the committee sought to discover whether the CIA has any method of preventing personal profit taking by intelligence directorate analysts who have access of clandestinely collected economic intelligence. The CIA has indicated that such an analyst would be in the same conflict of interest position as a staff member of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Department of Agriculture, or any other government agency for misuse of confidential material. Moreover, financial reporting requirements are imposed upon CIA employees. Similarly, the committee attempted to determine whether financial transactions were made by the complex to influence foreign stock markets or currencies. The 1970 review by the Inspector General found no evidence of such influence. Neither did the committee. All witnesses and documentary evidence indicated that the complex was never so used. Indeed, all agreed that the amounts involved in the fund were insufficient to destabilize any currency or market, even if such an effort had been made. The complex was subject to an audit in 1974, which concluded that it, quote, continued to be administered in an efficient and effective manner, and in compliance with applicable agency regulations and directives, end quote. Prior audit reports had commented on the need for a revised administrative plan. In accordance with earlier reports, the 1974 audit noted a, quote, new plan was approved in March 1975, end quote. In addition, quote, minor administrative and financial problems surfaced during the audit were discussed with brackets, project and brackets, officials, and resolved, end quote. The audit noted that total income for that year from interest, premiums, gain or loss on sales of securities, dividends, rentals, professional fees, gain on foreign exchange, gain on sale of property, and from miscellaneous transactions was in excess of $4 million. The total expenses for that year, allocation of premium income to reserve for claims, interest, salary, rent, accounting fees, taxes, loss on property, write-off, legal and other fees, communication, depreciation, and amortization, travel, equipment, rent, real estate expenses, pensions, due, and subscriptions, director fees, entertainment, and miscellaneous were nearly $2.5 million. These combined for a net income in excess of $1.5 million. Footnote 19. Reading footnote 19. 1974 Audit of Insurance Complex. Resuming the reading. The current chief of the cover and commercial staff has focused on the insurance investment project in a number of interviews with both the Rockefeller Commission and the committee. He has suggested that the real question for the complex is what its role and shape should be after the termination of many of the agency's proprietaries. End of page 219, beginning page 220. With their liquidation, he believes a reorganization and redefinition of the insurance investment complex is needed. As to the issue of a safeguard against misuse of project funds or, quote, insider, end quote, information by the agency, the chief of CCS has told the committee that the guarantees against such abuse are 1. Compartmentation, 2. The integrity of the chief of CCS, and 3. Display of portfolios to appropriate congressional committees. footnote 20. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 20. Chief, CCS, January 27, 76, pages 15 to 16. Resuming the reading. Houston agreed with the 3 safeguards outlined by the CCS chief. However, he added a fourth. When we were investing in stock, I would have the list of stock, the portfolio, reviewed by our contract people, and if I found we had any contract relationship with any of the companies involved, we'd either refuse to, well, a couple of times our investment advisor recommended a stock which I knew we had big contracts with, and I told the board no, this involves a conflict of interest. We won't touch it. And if we had anything from the agency contract office that indicated a relationship, we would either sell the stock or wouldn't buy it. Footnote 21. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 21. Houston, January 15, 76, page 80. The current charter for the insurance complex and the administrative plan forbid further acquisition of U.S. stocks and require the divestiture of American equity investments in the immediate future. Resuming the reading. Houston believes that the complex should continue in some form and that the current method, while not perfect, is the best that can be devised. The problem is that the generation of funds for these companies must be demonstrably legitimate and non-governmental if beneficiaries are to be protected, i.e., in absence of investment by an insurance corporation could well indicate to outsiders that its funding is actually coming from the federal government. Beyond, quote, doing business, end quote, peak non-governmental security investments by proprietaries active as of December 31st, 1974. The insurance and pension complex has sizable investments in both domestic and foreign securities markets. Its portfolio runs the gamut of notes, bonds, debentures, etc., but other proprietaries have also used this investment route as a method of increasing capital and ensuring adequate cover. For example, a domestic corporation purchases general merchandise in a manner which cannot be traced to the United States government. For example, a domestic corporation purchases general merchandise while this corporation has no outside commercial business and only 5 employees as of December 31st, 1974, it has invested over $100,000 in time deposits. A second domestic corporation purchases arms, ammunition, and police-related equipment for the Office of Logistics. This company has no employees and is managed by headquarters officials under alias. As of December 31st, 1974, this corporation had invested more than $30,000 in a certificate of deposit. A travel service proprietary was recently sold to an agency employee at the time of his retirement. This employee had ostensibly owned the firm, but had in fact managed it for the agency. As of end of page 220, beginning page 221. December 31st, 1974, this corporation had invested more than $30,000 in certificate of deposit. Footnote 23. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 23. The agency today uses this firm for the purchase of airline tickets for travel in support of sensitive projects. It is estimated by the agency that CIA business representatives about 30% of the gross airline ticket sales of the entity on an annual basis. Resuming the reading. An investment proprietary which was later dissolved had an investment of about $100,000 in Mexico as of March 31st, 1973. A Delaware corporation which has provided secure air support for agency employees, has classified pouches between headquarters and other agency facilities in the United States, has nearly $150,000 invested in a certificate of deposit. A former youth activity proprietary, in which the agency no longer retains an interest, had approximately $50,000 invested in time deposits as of March 31st, 1972. Another proprietary is part of a complex managed by the cover and commercial staff, which provides operational support for foreign operations. It is a Delaware corporation used to collect proceeds from the sale of agency proprietary entities and to refund such proceeds to the agency. Its total assets were nearly $750,000, and its total stockholders' equity was in excess of $15,000 as of December 31st, 1973. It has no employees. As of December 31st, 1974, it had invested almost $500,000 in a convertible subordinate debenture from the sale of a company and almost $50,000 in notes receivable. Another company in this complex is a foreign company which has been used as an investment vehicle for funds earmarked for new commercial operations, requiring agency investments. This investment project has been terminated and all funds were returned to the agency. The company has no employees. As of December 31st, 1973, it had invested nearly $250,000 in a security note of a private domestic corporation. A proprietary, which was part of the air support complex, had invested over $200,000 in a certificate of deposit as of December 31st, 1974. This entity was later sold. Another is part of the management and accounting complex. As of December 31st, 1974, it had nearly $500,000 invested in time deposits. The air proprietaries. History. Lawrence R. Houston, former CIA General Counsel, was involved in the establishment of the first set of agency proprietaries and has concluded that they should be a mechanism of last resorts. Houston maintains that the agency learned this, quote, the hard way, and almost all of the lessons involved probably came out one way or another in connection with a major aviation proprietary in the Far East. Others had their own special problems, but I think the Air America complex had pretty near everything, end quote. Footnote 24. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 24. January 15, 76, page 5. Resuming the reading. The agency acquired Air America in 1949, ostensibly to deny the assets of this company to the Communist Chinese. The CIA first arranged cash advances to the company in 1949. These advances were eventually credited to the agency's purchase of the corporation. At that time, Houston described the airline as follows. This normal aviation organization would have no meaning at all. This normal aviation organization, this would have no meaning at all, was completely at all. It would have no standing. End of page 221, beginning page 22. In international law, aviation rights, or any of that. But it worked for what they wanted, which was to take supplies up country into inland China, and then to bring back whatever cargo they could get commercially. Tallow, hides, bristles, all that sort of trade. And then they traded that off for their own account, and for a while the operation was fairly successful. The C-47s and C-46s. Footnote 25. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 25. IBID, page 6. Resuming the reading. To finance this activity, the lawyer for the airline organized a company, Civil Air Transport, which was funded by a Panamanian corporation. The two owners of Air America approached the agency in connection with a foreign operation in the spring of 1959 and indicated that unless they received financial assistance, the airline would go out of business. A series of meetings were held subsequently in which it was determined that the agency needed to contract for air transport in some of its operations, particularly those involving arms and ammunition. And so we entered into an agreement, I think in about September of 1949, whereby we would advance them the figure of $750,000 stakes in my mind, against which we could draw for actual use of the planes at an agreed on rate. And we did draw down, I think, all the flying time and expended the $750,000 between September and about January, at which time we suspended any further payments or drawdowns. I think the money was exhausted. Footnote 26. Reading footnote 26. IBID, page 7 to 8. Resuming the reading. The owners came to Washington in early 1950 for a series of discussions with the CIA. As a result of these negotiations, the agency agreed to advance more funds and received an option to purchase the assets of Civil Air Transport. Any unused portion of the advances was to be credited toward the purchase price. Air America operated under this arrangement until the owners, quote, came in the summer of 1950 and said again they were in desperate straits for funds, end quote. Footnote 27. Reading footnote 27. IBID, page 8. Resuming the reading. Another series of meetings was held at the agency in which it was concluded that the operations in the Far East would have a continuing need for secure airlift. There was also a general estimate that the loss of this airlift to the Chinese Communists would substantially assist them. Thus, quote, the agency then made the decision that they would exercise the option given there was no objection otherwise, end quote. Footnote 28. Reading footnote 28. IBID, page 9. Resuming the reading. The agency felt that it was necessary to obtain approval from the Department of State, so the head of the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination, who was responsible for the conduct of covert actions, and Mr. Houston visited the Assistant Secretary of State for the Far East. He and I went to see, in brackets, the Assistant Secretary, end brackets, and explained the situation. And, in brackets, he, in brackets, reminded us that it was basic U.S. policy not to get the government in competition with U.S. private industry, but under the particular circumstances, in particular, as there was really no U.S. private industry involved, end of page 222, beginning page 223, in the area, and they agreed it was important to deny the assets to the Red Chinese. State would go along on the understanding that we would divest ourselves of the private enterprise as soon as such a divestment was feasible and all of the circumstances that might obtain. Footnote 29. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 29. IBID, pages 9 to 10. Resuming the reading. The divestiture of these air proprietaries was not initiated until 1975, and some of the entities have not yet been fully divested. Mr. Houston noted, however, that we did not disregard that guidance because after very considerable use of this asset during the early 50s, there was a question of whether to continue it, and the matter was taken up in the National Security Council. And Allen Dulles, as director, proposed that we continue the ownership and control of the assets of Air America, as it then was known, including the subsidy as needed. And there was a subsidy at that time. It was about $1,200,000 per year. Footnote 30. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 30. IBID, page 10. Resuming the reading. The National Security Council considered whether this asset should be retained in 1956, and, on Dulles' recommendation, decided to continue the subsidy to Air America. The air proprietary's business consisted almost entirely of agency cargo carriage under contracts carrying military designations. The company was not organized, according to Houston, to fly common carriage and had no status in the international air business. The evidence indicates that during the early 1950s, there were two internal struggles. One was where control should lie in the agency, and the other was what policy should apply to the operation of the company itself. The struggle within the agency ranged all the way from sort of quiet management discussions as to what was good management to sometimes rather vociferous arguments of who is in charge here. And the operators always said, quote, well, we need to call the shots because it's our operation. And this is what we were running into all the time, of red-hot operators opposed to what we would consider good management. Footnote 31. Excuse me. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 31. IBID, page 12 to 13. And I'm going to read this section that was under footnote 30 as well. Houston indicated that there had been a subsidy running to the entities since 1949. Quote, $1.2 million represented about the maximum subsidy given until, I believe, about 1958 was the turning point. And from 1958 on, there was no subsidy as such that went into it, end quote. The reason for that, of course, was that the air complex had become, quote, money-making, end quote. Resuming the reading. The air proprietary was managed by elements of the Office of Policy Coordination. From the very outset, there were problems in this management structure. One such example is the acquisition of Air America in August 1950. Houston was participating in the negotiations at the invitation of the head of the Office of Policy Coordination. OPC was a curious organization, determined as being attached to the agency for quarters and rationing with policy. End of page 223, beginning page 224. Guidance from state, which was an impossible situation. Very nice fellows were doing the negotiating with, in brackets, OPC, end brackets. Quite unknown to me when they made the agreement to purchase carrying out the option. They gave the vendors the right to repurchase at any time within 2 years. And I thought this was really inconsistent with our whole position. And during the next 2 years, they negotiated out that repurchase agreement and in its place substituted an agreement to give them a first refusal if we were to dispose of the airline. That first refusal plagued us for years. They used to make all sorts of extraordinary claims under it, and it was never exercised, and eventually it was sort of forgotten when, in brackets, the owners, end brackets, died. It ran them personally, whether it ran to them and to others personally, and they all are dead now. But this shows a part of the learning curve, which was the thing we were going through. Footnote 32. Reading footnote 32. IBID pages 13 to 14. Resuming the reading. In the summer of 1954, Houston and a consultant traveled to the Far East to observe the operation. The consultant went, quote, specifically to look at the organization of the airline, end quote. At the time of the airline's purchase, the agency had formed a Delaware corporation to buy it. The corporate counsel and the consultant were both very concerned about the technical organization or lack of it in the operation. According to Houston, they demonstrated, to my satisfaction, that it was an absolute situation and that no one out there had the slightest understanding of any problem or what they were up against or wanted to do anything about it, in brackets, in terms of airline management, end brackets. Footnote 33. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 33. IBID, page 17. Resuming the reading. Following this review, a new organization designed to be more responsive to the Operations Directorate was created. Pacific Corporation held title to 40% of the equity in Air America, while the remainder was ostensibly owned by Chinese, who gave deeds of trust to the agency for their shares. For purposes of international law, this overt arrangement demonstrated that the company was majority owned and controlled by Chinese. Air America originally had several DC-4s and began modest operations between Hong Kong, Taipei, and Tokyo. The corporation soon acquired DC-6s, and it was at this time that the question of competition with private corporations first arose. Northwest Orient Airlines was then flying to Tokyo, Seoul, and Manila. A Northwest executive had noted the agency's interest in this area when he was chairman of the Civil Aeronautics Board in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Houston told the committee. He became head of Northwest, a very tight manager, a very capable fellow, and he used to complain that we were interfering. We were taking passengers off his airline, and we would go to him and say, we have to keep the airline in this business because the Chinese say they need an international airline. They are not ready to start their own yet. And it is end of page 224, beginning page 225. Necessary to its overall cover status as a going commercial concern. Footnote 34. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 34. IBID, page 21. Resuming the reading. By 1959, the executive had decided to ask the Civil Aeronautics Board for a decision. A meeting was held with the entire board, where the executive maintained, quote, that he was a private industry. He should not be interfered with by government competition, end quote. Footnote 35. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 35. IBID, page 22. Resuming the reading. The agency explained its situation, the need for cover, and their efforts to restrict carriage to the minimum necessary to retain their cover. And it ended up by one of the members of the board turning to, in brackets, the executive, end brackets, and saying, quote, you ought to be glad that you don't have a really good, reliable competitor in there, end quote. He said, quote, If you were being competed with by private business, you'd have real headaches. You ought to be real glad that it's not worse than it is. End quote. Footnote 36. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 36. IBID, page 22 to 23. Resuming the reading. In these proceedings, Houston conceded that some passengers were traveling on CIA aircraft rather than Northwest planes, but maintained that the impact was minimal and unavoidable. The CAB participated in discussions with both the agency and Northwest. After hearing both sides, the CAB, quote, came down on the side of the agency after making a reasoned judgment, end quote. Footnote 37. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 37. IBID, page 24. Resuming the reading. By 1960, the airline's international commercial business was not making money. Maintenance work in Taiwan, however, was, quote, normally a moneymaker, and this was, in brackets, contracted, end brackets, primarily, although not exclusively, with the U.S. Air Force, end quote. Footnote 38. Reading footnote 38. IBID, page 25. Resuming the reading. There were management problems in the maintenance operation, which originally stemmed from the fact that field personnel were not particularly astute in setting costs for their contracts. Houston cited one instance when the agency consultant replaced a corporation comptroller, who was very capable but, quote, had his own ideas of bookkeeping and controls, end quote. The consultant insisted that the corporation implement bookkeeping practices and controls consistent with CAB and FAA regulations. The military maintenance contracts were consistently audited by on-site teams. Footnote 39. Reading footnote 39. IBID, page 26. Resuming the reading. In the early 1960s, the CIA received an exemption from the Contract Renegotiation Board on grounds that renegotiation personnel might recognize that Air America was not a commercial operation and discovered that the CIA was involved. The agency went to the head of the Contract Renegotiation Board with a letter from the Department of Defense requesting an exemption on what it considered, quote, perfectly legitimate grounds, end quote. Footnote 40. Reading footnote 40. IBID. Resuming the reading. There was indeed a basis for exemption under the Negotiation Act, as the business was conducted entirely overseas, and the exemption was granted. The agency was concerned that it had made a type of profit, over 40% on the Air Force maintenance contracts, which may well have been the subject of renegotiation. End of page 225, beginning page 226. Had it not been subject to the exemption. Quote, so the question was what to do about it. And finally, we made a voluntary repayment against part of the profit on that contract to the Air Force. End quote. Footnote 41. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 41. IBID, page 27. Resuming the reading. As noted previously, the commercial airline aspect of the operation operated mostly at a loss. While there were periods when Air America cargo carriers were very busy on CIA contracts, the Korean War cargo carriers were the Korean War, Dien Bien Phu, and other paramilitary operations. There were also periods between these activities when there was nothing for Air airlines to do. During these periods of inactivity, the airline was still saddled with the expenses such as crew salaries and the maintenance of grounded aircraft. To alleviate this problem, we finally organized the standby contract, which was an apparent military entity on Okinawa. It was our entity, but it had a military designation. I can't remember the name for it, and that entity contracted with Air America for so many hours of cargo standby to be available anytime on call, and that they would pay so much for that capability being maintained. So that is how we kept the subsidy going to maintain them during periods when there was not profitable flying. Footnote 42. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 42. IBID page 29. Resuming the reading. Another area of concern was the proprietary's relationship with the Internal Revenue Service. From the outset, the company's management was informed that they would be required to pay appropriate taxes, while there were the usual arguments about whether certain items were appropriate for taxation and whether certain deductions should have been granted. The relationship maintained with the IRS was basically a normal one. Houston recalled that in the mid-1950s, Air America received notice of an upcoming audit by the IRS. Company officials came to the agency and indicated that this might pose a security problem. The CIA went to the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service and indicated that they wished to have an audit conducted by an IRS team on an unwitting basis to see what they could learn. Quote, "We thought it would be a good test of the security of our arrangements." End quote. Footnote 43. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 43. IBID, page 30. Resuming the reading. Later, the IRS personnel would be notified that they had begun to audit an agency proprietary, and the audit would be discontinued. They put a very bright young fellow on, and he went into it. They came up with discrepancies and things that would be settled in the normal tax argument, corporate IRS argument, and all of these were worked eventually. And then we went to this fellow and said, quote, "Now, this was owned and backed by the CIA, the U.S. government. What was your guess as to what was happening?" End quote. And he said, quote, "Well, I knew there was something going on there, and I thought what a wonderful asset it would be for the Russians to have, but I came to the conclusion that it was Rockefeller money." End quote. Footnote 44. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 44. IBID. End of page 226, beginning page 227. As the operations of Air America developed, problems arose involving large cargo carriers. In the early days of its operation, the airline used C-54s, which had an extremely limited range, but were able to perform under demanding circumstances. Discussions proceeded during that period about modernizing the equipment, and the agency, through Air America, bought DC-6ABs. These aircraft were a conversion of the DC-6 with large cargo doors installed. Air America did not maintain any jet equipment at that point. In the early 1950s, Air America became deeply involved in a military air transport system. This system was originally known as MATS and later as MAC. They got MATS contracts, and Air America got these, and these were very good to keep a constant utilization at a good rate. The MATS rates were usually good because the policy was not to do competitive bidding for the lowest bidder, because then you got the poorest service. But give good rates to the carriers, and then require the carrier belong to the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. Footnote 45. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 45. IBID 36. Resuming the reading. In 1956, MATS changed its policy and required that bidders on their contracts be certified. Because Air America could not become certificated, the agency decided to purchase Southern Air Transport. While this corporation was technically a separate entity, not involved with Air America, it was actually an integral part of the complex from a management perspective. All management decisions for Southern Air Transport were made by the same CIA consultant and advisory team that established Air America policy. Eventually, MAC decided to require that bidders not only be certificated, but that they also have equipment qualified for the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, i.e., jet aircraft. As a result, the agency acquired Boeing 727s and convinced Boeing to modify the 727 by enlarging the ventral exit, enhancing its airdrop capability. So the theory was that the 727s would be used on MAC contracts to be available on an overriding basis if needed for major national security operation. They were used usually when they had spare time. To my recollection, they were only called off once, off the actual contract time. This was for a possible use which didn't go through. But the White House asked if we had the capability to move something from here to there. I think from the Philippines to somewhere in Southeast Asia. I don't recall, and so they sent word to management that they wanted a plane available at the earliest opportunity at Clark Field. They pulled one of them off the MAC contract and had it available, I think ready to go, in 12 hours, all set for the operation. And the operation was never called, but it showed what the capability was and what they had to do to get substitute service for the MAC contract. Footnote 46. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 46. IBID page 39. Resuming the reading. During the late 1960s, several Chinese airlines began operations on a limited scale. With the establishment of these indigenous airlines, end of page 227, beginning page 228. Flying Far East routes, the CIA considered reducing its international carriage work. The agency decided to retain the MAC contracts because they did not compete with the native enterprises, but plans to reduce Air America's international common carriage were initiated. Another CIA proprietary, Civil Air Transport Company, Ltd., which had been organized in 1954, had been the first agency entity to engage in common carriage. Later, Air America did the American contracting, followed by Southern Air Transport, which also performed MAC and MATS contracts with planes leased from Air America. Footnote 47. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 47. SAT actually owned one 727 and leased two from Air America. Resuming the reading. Houston noted that in the late 1960s, an internal decision was made that we probably couldn't justify this major airlift with the big jets, so we started getting rid of them. See, they had no utilization to speak of down in Southeast Asia. A couple of supply flights went into, in brackets, another area in brackets, and I think we used prop planes for that, to my recollection. Footnote 47A. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 47A. IBID, page 42. Resuming the reading. So the agency began to phase out the 727s, which contributed to the decision to divest itself of Southern Air Transport and Air America. Internal management was streamlined in 1963 by the establishment of an executive committee consisting of the boards of directors of the Pacific Company, Air America, and Air Asia. The over board of directors in New York City passed a resolution organizing an over executive committee, which consisted of the CIA consultant and 2 other directors. Covertly, the agency added its own representatives to this committee, which allowed representatives of management, agency, and the operators to meet, consider policies, and give guidance to the company. Houston indicated that this mechanism was extremely effective in controlling the company. So, I think for the last, 15, 18 years, the proprietary management system was on the whole pretty effective. From the agency point of view, I think we knew what was going on. I think we were able to get things up for decisions, and if we couldn't resolve them at the staff level, we would take them up to the director for decisions. Quite different from the early days in the early 50s that I described, and the operators at least made the claim that they had the right to call the tune. Footnote 48. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 48. IBID, page 46 to 47. Resuming the reading. During this period of time, Operations Directorate personnel were getting themselves involved in the acquisition of aircraft, and which were getting awfully damned expensive at this time, and separate projects were going after some of this expensive equipment without consideration of what might be available elsewhere to the agency by contract or old aircraft. And so the director of the Central Intelligence set up XCOM Air, of which I was chairman, and had represented from both the operation and management and finance. End of page 228, beginning page 229. Out of the agency to try and coordinate the overall control and acquisition and disposition of aircraft. Footnote 49. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 49. IBID, page 51. So I'm gonna stop here for this recording.